Sheena Baratono, and I'm going to talk today about neuroaesthetics. I am a cognitive neurology fellow right now in Beth Israel, and I was working at the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics the last couple of years. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what I learned there, especially from what I learned from Dr. Anton Chatterjee, who runs the center. So first question is, what is neuroaesthetics? It's a newer field that really came to fruition around the beginning of the 21st century. And by definition, it is the study of the neural underpinnings of the aesthetic experience. And generally, aesthetic experience is thought to be pleasurable experiences. This can relate to tons of different fields, including art, faces and beauty, attraction, music, consonance and dissonance, smell, and even in more abstract entities like math, or let's say you write a computer program, you can say that's a beautiful program. There's still that pleasurable experience that underlies that, and that would be incorporated within the study of neuroaesthetics. So what we're going to talk about today is I'm going to really focus in on vision, and within vision, faces, and beautiful faces and attraction to faces. Largely because there's more data studying this, it's more accessible, and our understanding of reactions to faces is a little bit simpler than it is to art and architecture, which has bigger and broader political and historical influence. So faces. Humans are drawn to faces. We see faces everywhere. Think of an emoticon. I can draw 3 rectangles there and you see a face. They're not the same shape, it's just the orientation. We're very attuned to this. It's important for our cultural interactions and therefore has a really high amount of energy devoted to that in the brain, and is very important. So within this, we know that personal preferences for attraction do vary significantly. That's true at a population level within different communities, but there are generalizabilities and certain characteristics are preferred. There's a few historically that I'm going to go over. Some of them are debatable and we'll get into that. I also want to mention that there are cultural upbringings and exposure differences. There's one notable one that I'll get to when we talk about averageness. And I want to apologize that most of the data in this field is based on white heterosexual norms, largely because the participants are of this group, but also that a lot of the faces and data examples that are provided are from white heterosexuals. There are exceptions to this, which I will go into. So first thing is, like I said, humans look at faces, we're attracted to faces in general, let alone do we think that faces are attractive or unattractive. So we see this even in infants. In one study, 6-month-old infants were sitting with their moms, and then we were looking at how they're looking at faces, how long they're looking at faces. The faces were predetermined using the Likert scale by college-age men and women. They showed them tons of faces. They said, these are the most attractive, these are the most unattractive, and then those were the ones that were used in the study. That idea of using attractive and unattractive faces is really pervasive across most of the work in the field. So most of these babies were white. The average age was 6 months. And what they found was the babies spent more time looking at the faces that were judged as attractive than the ones that were unattractive. And this was true regardless of sex, male or female babies and male or female faces. Babies spent more time looking at the faces that were deemed to be attractive. Not only did they look at them, but they interacted with them. So in a separate study looking at 12-month-old babies, they found that they approached and spent more time interacting with a person that had an attractive face than a person with an unattractive face. So this perception of faces and the preference for attractive faces is present at such young ages and before there are strong cultural influences. So what components of faces do people deem to be attractive, and which ones are more pervasive across cultures? There's really 3 things that come out, and there have been hundreds of studies on this, most notably averageness. Averageness being take a bunch of faces, average them together, that's deemed more beautiful, and I'll get into that. The symmetry of faces and the sexual dimorphisms are driven by hormonal differences in men and women. So average faces. This finding was really started in the 1800s. Sir Francis Galton, who actually created the idea of eugenics and the term eugenics. We used film to create composite images of people's faces. What he was trying to do originally was to identify something common amongst criminals. He was averaging faces of criminals versus soldiers, but what he found was that all of these faces, when averaged, were attractive. Here's a picture of what he was looking at, and he actually did a lot more than just criminality. Looked at people that were sick. He compared women with syphilis compared to women that were healthy and not going to get syphilis. But there wasn't one facial feature that came out of all of this that showed healthy, not healthy, criminal, not criminal. It was really that average faces appeared more attractive. So more recent data. So in one study, they averaged about 6 or 5 faces together. And what they found was that people deemed that averaged face more attractive than any of the component faces. So I can show you face A, but you're going to say that the composite face is more attractive than face A, face B, face C, and so on. Most of the data in the field is related to this, but there's even computational modeling where they enter into their mathematical model bunches of faces, attractive faces, unattractive faces, and then they look and see how are things pulled out. And they found that the faces that correlated more with averaged features, including the averaged faces that they entered, were very important. One of the factors that came out as being this is more attractive than not. We also know that preference for average faces may not apply to other ethnicities, but this really depends on your exposure and your upbringing. So in one study by Apatilla et al., they took faces from white Europeans and faces from the Hadza tribe in northern Tanzania. They took individual pictures and they averaged them, and then they showed these to populations in both regions. What they found was that the white Europeans found the average faces either of the white group or of the Hadza tribe more attractive than the individual faces. However, when they showed these pictures to people in Tanzania of the Hadza tribe, they had a different outcome. These people found that the average faces of themselves, of their in-group, were more attractive, but they did not pick that the average faces of the white Europeans were more attractive than the individual pictures of the white Europeans. Their thought and rationale for this was that the white Europeans were exposed to a lot more ethnicities and therefore had developed this preference for averageness across all of them, but that was not the case in this more isolated tribe in northern Tanzania. And you can debate that. There's another study that looked at ethnicities from China, from Japan, and then they used average faces, and their in-group were also considered more attractive when they were averaged. And another one that looked at people from the United States, I should say, Brazil, and indigenous Paraguayans, and they found, though, in this study, all of those 3 groups picked the average faces from any of those 3 groups as more attractive. So there's some discrepancy whether or not your in-group or out-group matters, but generally speaking, average faces are deemed more attractive than individual faces. And there's a demo that I'm going to go to. All right, so this is from Dr. DeBruyne and Dr. Jones' website. And what you can see here is it's a really interesting website, and they have a lot of demos you can do for face research, but we're going to do this one in averageness. So what you can do is you can pick from any of these faces on the right, and then they will make a composite average of those faces. Like I mentioned earlier, generally you want to have 5 or 6 to really get this. And so we'll start by picking the first 5 males or 6 males, and let's see what that average looks like. So the thought is that this average person here is more attractive than any of the individuals, and the data have shown that most people would agree with that concept. So there are your individuals, and then there's your composite. And we'll do the same thing for women. We'll take the first few women here. Oops. 7, and do the average. And again, this composite picture is deemed, generally speaking, more attractive than any of these individual faces. And you can see here, you can do that across some various ethnicities, and that still tends to be the result. So why do we see this? There's really 2 main theories that come up. One is that average faces reflect genetic diversity and better adaptability to the environment. You can look at a lot of the older literature in particular said people of mixed ethnicities were more attractive versus people that were inbred were less attractive. And so genetic diversity is healthy, you have more fitness, and you're more likely to pass on your genes, and therefore we like that better. The other theory is that average faces better align with the concept of a face prototype. So when you have any object, really, you develop a prototype as to what that object is. and you see tons of different faces, and that the prototype you store in your brain of what a face would be the average of all those faces together. And because of that, there's an association, which is the harder part, for attractiveness versus unattractiveness, and that's what you associate. So moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about symmetry, and not going to go into this in as much detail. The first part really is, I think most people would agree that gross asymmetries are markers of unattractiveness. And sometimes this can be related to decreased genetic fitness, developmental disorders, birth defects, susceptibility to infection, scars on the face. It's not always the case. Again, this is a very broad idea, but that maybe asymmetry means bad genetics, and therefore that makes it less attractive. But you also start to wonder about more subtle differences with symmetry and asymmetry. And there's heterogeneity in the results in this field, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And part of it is how symmetric faces are generated. So in this study, what they did is they blended faces together to create symmetry. So it was images that were in a mirror, and then they blended those together. And these were deemed to be more attractive than the original slightly asymmetric faces. Most of the data that shows that symmetry might not be associated with attractiveness was done where they bisected the face and then they doubled up one side or the other. The problem with this is, let's say somebody's nose is a little asymmetric at baseline and a little bit larger on the right side than the left side. When you cut it in half and you make your two duplicates, one of those is going to have a nose that's maybe a little too narrow, whereas the other one's going to have a nose that's a little too wide. But when you really look at the data of these kind of blended faces that are more symmetric in terms of, not really more symmetric, it's not the right word, but a little bit more equal in the way the features are brought together, they are deemed more attractive than not. And this is kind of a segue into the next portion, but another study was looking at symmetric faces, attractiveness, and what they called a masculinity index. The masculinity index is something that they looked at pictures, they measured out the face, and that's how most of this work is done. And they created really a standardized index based on cheekbone prominence and the relative lower face length, and said, this is how we're going to decide masculinity or masculine more or less versus others. They had heterosexual women look at this, and they found a correlation, an interaction effect between the symmetric face and the masculinity index, leading to higher attractiveness ratings. Again, this is in heterosexual women. It's a very smaller field and is difficult to generalize, but we're going to go ahead and look a little bit more at hormonally influenced features with sexual dimorphisms. So the two main hormones that are important with puberty and with making somebody look more masculine or feminine, generally speaking, is testosterone in men. It fuels features, it really fuels that square jaw, that larger brow bone that, like in this study, they thought were masculine. One thing to note is testosterone does suppress the immune system. And if you go back to Darwin's work, you really, the thought is for sexual fitness that this is a feature of, well, I have a weakness, but I'm overcoming it. Think of the peacock with that glorious tail. Look, I can be burdened by this, but I'm still amazing. I can get by, I lived, and therefore you should like me because I'm so fit, I could overcome this impedance. With the women, you're looking more at estrogen. And some of those features include full lips, large eyes, higher cheekbones. And so that's a sign of femininity, but also of sexual fitness, broadly speaking. So when you look at the data, so this study was using masculinity ratings based on what people thought were masculine and not masculine, or feminine and not feminine. And they were looking at people who had a preference for men or women that were either men or women, and that they found that the higher masculine ratings did correlate with attractiveness ratings, while feminine ratings did associate with ratings of females that were more attractive. And this was within people that either had preference for the same sex or the opposite sex. So that's one that wasn't just about heterosexual men or women. And then going back to that earlier study where they used mathematical modeling to look at what determines attractiveness, sexual dimorphisms did fall out in that as well. So broadly speaking, averageness, symmetry, and hormonally influenced features are all thought to provide a basis for attractiveness of faces and beauty. The data can be varied at times, but over hundreds of studies, that's kind of the three things that keep falling out that most people adhere to. One thing when you hear about all of this is you want to think about morality. And one stereotype and bias is that beauty is good. This is true across cultures, even ones where they have maybe slightly different preferences for what beauty is, but the idea that beauty is better than non-beauty is pretty pervasive. And when you think of beauty as good, you can't ignore the idea that anomalous or disfigured is bad. And people with facial disfigurements do experience discrimination. This is true in the workplace. This is true out in public, whereas the same thing is true. Beauty is good. People that are more beautiful are generally given more money. They're promoted more quickly. So there's changes in behavior. This can be studied with more discrete cognitive neuroscience testing using things such as the ultimatum game, where a person, let's say you're the subject and I'm the moderator, I show you the picture of a person and I say, this is the person you're playing against. They are going to give you some money and you have the choice to decide, should I take that money, should I not? So let's say they have $20, they want to give you $5, and then they keep 15. You can accept it, in which case you both get that money, or you can decline it. So you're basically punishing the other person and neither of you get the money. When the person you're playing against has a facial anomaly, people are more inclined to punish that individual than accept the money. In another study looking at unconscious bias, they had, you had a number. There was a face and a number on one side, a face and a number on the other side, and the face was attractive or less attractive. And you weren't supposed to really pay attention to the face, but you were supposed to move your mouse to the number closer to the number that you had. And what they found was that, let's say I'm supposed to go to this number, but the attractive face is on the other side, that the arc of the mouse would drift towards the more attractive face. So there's an unconscious kind of behavior there with motion that suggests that you are more attracted or more interested in and more salient with the attractive face than the other face. Okay. So overall, we talked about those three features. We said this is present in infancy and that this can actually cause bias and that bias can change behavior. So moving on to our next topic, which is what is neural processing of faces? And Isaiah got into some of this already, so I'm going to blow through part of it. The localization of the brain for faces. And then the two main studies that people use to identify this area and how that means it interacts with beauty are fMRI, which is blood flow, and then lesions such as strokes or tumors and other things like that. So he already showed something similar to this, which is the visual pathway. Here in the yellow, I can't see my mouse, I don't think it's showing up, is the primary visual cortex. You have all these association cortices. MTRV5 really pays attention to motion. On the bottom of the brain, there it goes, you have the fusiform gyrus, and part of that is the fusiform face area, which here is in the light blue. Next to that, you have a couple other parts of your visual cortex that associate for certain types of objects. There's the lateral occipital cortex in the dark blue, and there's the parahippocampal place area in the green. So you have these different areas, and a phenomenon similar to some of the ones Isaiah talked about is called prosopagnosia, which occurs when you have damage to the fusiform face gyrus. This leads to an inability to perceive faces. When you hear about this, your first thought is something like this, where people just can't see faces or they're face blind. But if you look at descriptions of these patients or interact with them, and one great example is in Oliver Sacks' book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for her hat. The man, it wasn't that he couldn't necessarily see the face. He could see parts of the face that he would recognize people. So let's say this was your friend, you'd see that nose, oh, that nose, that's Don, that's probably who that is. Or this person, oh, that's my friend with red hair and big teeth, that's probably Glenn. So you can see features, but you can't consolidate that into a perception of a face as a whole. And just one segue or kind of a side note here, in popular culture, actually, Brad Pitt has said that he suffers from face blindness and that he has difficulty perceiving faces, and that this has actually caused him trouble because he'll ignore people because he doesn't think he recognizes them or he doesn't know them, when in fact he does, and they get kind of offended. And I don't know if he ever actually got tested for this or if he really has prosopagnosia, but I thought that was an interesting example. Okay, so we know how faces are perceived. So what are the neural underpinnings of beauty? How do you draw those first 2 points together? And the big thing is really the pleasure centers in the brain. And how do you connect the visual experience with pleasure centers to make the experience of beauty? So a little bit about the reward pathways. The main neurotransmitters are dopamine, as well as glutamine and GABA. Serotonin is also involved, but dopamine is created in the kind of red circle there, the ventral tegmentum or ventral tegmental area. And then that has projections that go to various parts of the brain with different functions. There's the hippocampal area, HIPP, which is memory formation, the amygdala and the front at the bottom, which is really emotion. You think if you get that fear response, you watch a horror movie, you go to a haunted house, that part of that's the amygdala is really driving that. You have the prefrontal cortex, which is part of the brain that's higher level processing, decision making, and experience of what that is. And you have the nucleus accumbens, which you can see has projections from all of these areas as well. And it is very important in associating behavior with reward. So it kind of integrates everything together and then sends these projections or interactions to create the phenomena of aesthetics. So some of this data. So heterosexual young men were evaluated in an fMRI study. They were looking at attractiveness. And what they found was that there's increased blood flow in the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmentum. They looked at a couple of other areas, but I'm not going to go into those details because the main significant findings were here. So what they had people do, these were heterosexual young men, like I said. They had them look at beautiful female faces or average female faces and beautiful male or average male faces. What they found is above baseline, there was a significant increase in blood flow activity within the nucleus accumbens when the men were looking at beautiful female faces. The male results are a little bit harder to kind of go through, but what they found was a significant interaction effect. And that was same in the ventral tegmentum. That most notably, there's an increase in blood flow to this area when you're looking at beautiful faces of your preferred sex, particularly to narrow it down, heterosexual young men looking at women. In another study, so we know this is showing us that the reward circuit is involved. How does that interact with vision? And is there a way to pull everything together? So this study was done differently. They asked subjects in fMRI to judge whether or not a face was more or less attractive than average. So they weren't really asked, are you attracted to this, but do you think this is an attractive face compared to your average, kind of your internal idea of what a face is? What they found was that the fusiform face area and the lateral occipital cortex, which is for objects, had significantly increased blood flow when they were looking at faces that were thought to be more attractive. The judgment of attractive or unattractive and how they decided on what each data point would be was done by a separate group of people, similar to the Likert scale I mentioned earlier. Notably, the parahippocampal place area did not show an increase in neural activity. This is a good control that shows that this is really specific to the face areas, not to the place area, which would be more active in landscapes, and it is in data looking at that. So here's that picture of that data. On the left, you can see these three different areas where they are in the brain. And in the middle, you can see, based on the yellow and the orange, that there's increased blood flow. And that was when they were looking at the already deemed attractive faces. The blue and the green are areas where there was increased blood flow when people were looking at the unattractive faces. So just something to keep in mind. That's kind of the back and forth of what they're looking at. But at the bottom of it, you see that there's significant increased blood flow in the fusiform face area and in the lateral occipital cortex. The area up front is related more to the anterior insula. They also showed increased activation in the parietal, medial, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortices. And those were thought to be more related to emotion in the amygdala and judgment and attention discrimination within the task of the prefrontal and parietal cortices. Okay, so this is telling us that there's increased activation in your face recognition areas when you look at attractive faces. So maybe that's just salience, so the attractive faces are more easy to identify. We're not quite sure, but is that there when you're not thinking about attractiveness? Is there an unconscious change when you look at an attractive face than an unattractive face? So one thing to say, I'm thinking about attractiveness, I get excited, you're looking at this and therefore there's a change, but what if you're not looking at that? What if you're not meaning to? And that's another part of the study. So now they asked subjects, are these two faces identical or different? And what they had were actually, they had taken two faces and morphed them. So they had, 1/3 more similar to this, 1/3 more to this, and that's what they were using for comparisons. And now when subjects were asked to say, are these identical or not, they still found increased blood flow in the fusiform face area and lateral occipital cortex, and no change in the PPA as expected. Here's a picture of that data. So pretty robust increases in blood flow to these areas that are important for attractiveness and faces. Notably, you don't see as much of that when you're looking at the anterior insula. I can't show you, but the orange one up top, meaning that maybe there's less of an emotional reaction, but you're still having this change when you're unconsciously looking at attractiveness in the areas relevant for facial recognition. Going beyond that to more frontal areas of the brain, there's a lot of data looking at the orbital frontal cortex, and this is part of the brain that sits right above the eyes and is involved with more higher order processing. What they find is that there's increased activity in this area when looking at attractive faces per your sexual preference, and that this is thought to be relevant to your representation of reward. Another study looked at attractiveness and morality. So they were given images of people and they were given sentences about an action somebody did that was considered moral or immoral. And then they were looking at reaction times and the association between the two, and found that on fMRI, there's an increase in activity when they're judging them together. And it was the opposite when it was an immoral and unattractive face. And then bridging this one step further to memory, there's increased functional connectivity measures between the orbital frontal cortex and the hippocampal memory region when you're encoding and trying to remember attractive faces than when you're trying to remember unattractive faces. So this idea of beauty is pervasive, and it spreads beyond just, oh, you consciously acknowledge that somebody is attractive or unattractive, but actually affects your behavior, your memory, and higher cognitive function. Now, I think I'm running out of time. I don't know, Mike, you can nod or shake your head if I am or not. So I'm not going to go into this, but there's a lot of work looking at art and architecture. But again, that's a little bit more complicated because history and politics play a large role. So I already went over the conclusion, so I'm going to not go into that any further. And put some thanks mostly to Anjan and the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics, as well as Michael Ferguson, who created this talk, and then Michael Fox in the Berenson Allen Center. And lots of references for anybody that's interested.
Thank you very much, Sheena. This is such a fantastic segue into the neuroscience of spirituality, as you'll see here in a moment. And for anybody who may be curious once I get into my talk, I will assure you that this was not a setup at the level of neural mechanisms. This was a setup at the level of conceptual relationships, largely drawing from the history of philosophy. And I'm so delighted at the way that we're about to play together in this common sandbox of brain.